Okay, so Outriders Worldslayer just dropped. It's fire, hot fire, maybe. I don't know, I'm gonna have to cover it in the next video. But before I get to that, this is gonna be a much quicker video, you know, something I could just throw down, help the community or whatever. I wanted to make a build video. Oh my God! Wow! I don't do build videos, but I think this one's really interesting for a few reasons. With Worldslayer, they introduced a lot of nerfs to meta mods and even some just normal survivability mods, stuff like that. I would check out, what is it, like NYL casuals video, something like that. I'll probably link it, put it up in the cards, whatever. This video is just to showcase one of the builds that I personally love for the Trickster. It's a revolver build, and I know revolvers are hot trash in Outriders.
Trash!
But if you're creative enough and with the right setup, even revolvers can be really, really good. So I'm super petty. I try to use pistols in every game I play if it's possible. And so this game is no exception. I wanted to use the pistol. I didn't want to use dual pistols. I wanted to use the revolver. So I've managed to make the revolver broken. And I mean that, bro. This build is so disgustingly broken. It's kind of wild. So we're gonna start with the basic skill tree. Into the middle tree is the main tree we're going throughout. I picked 20% less damage from elites. Honestly, you could probably just copy paste this. I'm not about to go into too much detail. I picked the mitigation to shield over the armor because the way armor scales, and mitigation is really hard to get in most cases other than a few mods and stuff like that. So I would just go with the mitigation, especially since shield is a huge part of this build. This is probably the most important skill on this whole tree. Every activation of deception grants you 50% shield. So basically you just want to spam deception skills to stay alive. And then I went a bit into the damage tree. I might change this because honestly I have so much armor piercing on this build. I don't think I need all this. If I were to move some points around, I would probably put them into this point right here, critical damage, because critical damage is busted. Maybe even this one, but I feel like it's kind of hard to be behind enemies and also get headshots, so that's why I didn't have any points invested in that one. So let's get to the skills. First one, we have Time Rift. You know what it does. It makes dudes float for 7 seconds or whatever and inflicts weakness. And inflicts weakness. Weakness decreases the amount of damage that enemies can do to you, if I remember. So it helps you stay alive. And it also CCs enemies. We have Hunt the Prey because it's fun to use. And we also have a movement mod or whatever in our class skill thing, so it gives us extra damage. And then Slow Trap because I don't really like Temporal Knife. With this build, it's more effective in my opinion to just use Slow Trap, and it'll make more sense once I go into the mods. Now finally, let's get to the juicy parts. Now I want to make it very clear, this is the build I more or less use to get through the story in about 5 to 10 hours, give or take. We're going to start it off with the helmet. The helmet has critical hits on an elite, increases your firepower by 64k for 10 seconds. I actually didn't have this on here originally. I did this after I ran through it. Honestly, any firepower increasing skill would at least work reasonably here. But the most important thing is the Time Rift mod, long range, that triples the skills range. The original range is trash, it's doo-doo, so this is an absolute needed mod for this build. But also, this is part of the gear set, which increases damage by 5% per enemy affected by the deception skill, which is Time Rift and the bubble thing. So if you hit 10 enemies, you have 50% extra damage until they die, but they will probably die really quickly, honestly. So the damage, it's nice. I did get a piece. This isn't the original piece. It's rolled almost exactly the same way though, so it doesn't really matter. I have Shield Blast. That's almost completely useless with this build because you're gonna have shields almost 100% of the time. You could just get a normal piece that just has either bullet recycling or damage absorber on it, and it honestly would barely make a difference. You could kind of mess around with the stats a bit, but you want close range damage and bonus firepower and possibly anomaly power if you can get it. And then we have 2 more pieces of the Trespasser set, which are the pants and the gloves. Every enemy affected by the wave receives vulnerable status. That's extremely important. That makes you do extra damage. There are some enemies that aren't really affected by the skill, but it'll still cause vulnerable, which is really important. The second one, it's nice, but honestly, putting out so much damage, as long as you have the set bonus, that's all that really matters, as long as you have that first mod. This one's incredibly important. I wouldn't change anything on this piece. The 20% of weapon damage and 20% of anomaly damage dealt to one affected enemy will be transferred to another affected enemy is busted with this build. It's absolutely insane. I have so many multipliers on Time Rift that it's shredding their defenses, it's CCing them, and all the damage you do is being shared between all the enemies. So once you combine all that, you're doing ridiculous amounts of damage. But you also have the second one, which holds them in the air for 2 times longer. I didn't think this was that useful, but before using this specific skill, you die incredibly easily, or at least I was in like higher level content, because the CC is really useful. So I would just keep this one on there. If you can replace it, it's possible, but I feel like it would just make things more difficult. I like it. And then finally, Time Rift. Enemies affected by the skill have both their armor and resistance decreased by 20% for 6 seconds. I didn't even notice that they nerfed this because it used to be 30% until now, but I'd still put it on there because it's still busted. And then Captain Hunter is extremely important. I've put a lot of different mods on here, but the multiplier when you're increasing your damage against elites is just insane. Usually the fodder enemies aren't really an issue. It's usually the elites that I have issues with. If I have issues with anyone, especially in Worldslayer, the bosses are a lot stronger. So I would not remove this. This is absolutely necessary, all right? Just keep it on there. Better version of this mod. I mean, you could replace it, but most people probably have this if they've been playing the game up to this point. And then the extra bullet, increase your magazine size, it's not that important actually. I forgot to go over this. Reloading a weapon when your shield is active disables ammo consumption for 5 seconds. The main issue with the revolver, the range is really bad, but the worst part I think is just the reload. It only has 6 and maybe like 8 or 9 bullets if you increase the magazine size through either skill tree or mods. But if you have this, and since your shield is almost always up, as long as you reload, you have 5 seconds where you could just spam bullets. So this is probably one of the most important parts of this entire gear set. If you want to run this the way that I'm running it, then this is a non-negotiable mod, the only mod that makes the revolver even somewhat useful. And then finally, the actual firearm. Now, I got extremely lucky with this. I don't know how I managed to get this to drop, but I will say this, I didn't get this until later into the run, so I was still doing pretty well without this. I only had the 2 mod version, but if you could get any apocalyptic one, honestly, almost anything, it'll probably be pretty busted as well. I picked this specific exotic version for very specific reasons. Now, Strings of Gauze, it's a good mod, but it also has huge disadvantages. Shots link up to 5 enemies in a 10-meter radius of the target and deal almost 200k damage to each of them. Now, the main problem with this mod is it doesn't do damage to the actual enemy that you're shooting. So if you're just trying to kill one guy, it's basically a wasted mod. But the cool thing about this build is the more enemies that are present on the battlefield or whatever, the more damage you do effectively, because the way Time Rift and the gear set bonus works. So the entire premise of this build is to try to group up enemies into small clumps and then just shred them as quickly as possible and then move on to the next round. So there's a level of positioning, a level of crowd control and things like that that all come into the build. But the reason why I kept this mod on here specifically is because, one, it goes to 5 enemies, which is more than most other mods, and it's also in a 10-meter radius, so you could kill large groups of enemies extremely easily with this. But if you also combine that with the fact that Time Rift shares 30% of its damage. It shares 20% of weapon damage and 20% of anomaly damage once you hit them. And you're gonna hit 5 enemies just when this gets procced once, and it procs every 2 seconds. And then on top of that, you're gonna be shooting the enemy, obviously. And then I have the second mod. This honestly wasn't on there before. I had Dark Sacrifice. Dark Sacrifice sucks now. They nerfed it into the ground. It's absolute garbage. They shouldn't have nerfed it that much. That's the one mod. No, they went too far with that mod. It's trash. But I used Dark Sacrifice to this playthrough and did mostly fine. Once again, I only died one time to the final boss. There's only one enemy, so it was like the worst case scenario I could have been in. So I had Dark Sacrifice. That works if you wanted to make a build, like min-max it, and you only had 2 slots. Fortress, because Fortress is it's basically just a better version of Dark Sacrifice at this point. It gives you armor, and you also get the damage increase. You should probably have those if you've been playing the game, and if you haven't, you could earn them somewhat easily through doing expeditions and stuff like that. If you're okay with using stuff from this campaign or whatever, this mod is really cool. I like this mod, the death ray, because one, it's not really a triggered mod. I mean, it is because you aim down sights, but like it doesn't have a cooldown. So you can use it almost anytime you want, although it does take up a bit of charge time. But you can do this infinitely as long as you don't get hit and you keep aiming down sights. It's kind of crazy, but the main reason why I like it on this build is because one, you can do anomaly damage and weapon damage at the same time when you're fighting an enemy. It's really good for focused fire and stuff, but the main reason is that the revolver has trash range. It's terrible. You have to be like hugging an enemy for it to do full damage, but that beam has no range, or if it does have range, it's really far. So it kind of takes away downsides of using a revolver. You don't really have to worry about changing weapons or an enemy being too far away. Certain enemies, like the ones that fly, the stupid bugs, bro, the bugs that literally everyone hates, they always ran away and they would be in the air. So most of the time it was really difficult for me to do full damage to them because they were always out of range of the revolver. If you find something else you really like the way this mod works, I might change it later, we'll see. Now, that's more or less the build. Tactics, you just group up as many enemies as you can, cast Time Rift, slow them all down, and then just melt them. Sometimes it's better to focus on the weaker enemies because then they'll do extra damage to the stronger enemies in the thing, because the way that the mods work and class skills. When it comes to the packs tree, now I'm only going to assume you have 2 points on the packs tree because you get those fairly early on in the Worldslayer campaign, and this is meant to be like a class guide for people who need help getting through the campaign. It's not a class guide for endgame stuff. I'll make an updated one on that later once I have like min-maxed apocalyptic god rolls or something, but for now I'm just going to use the first 2 points. Your damage is increased by 15% for each skill on cooldown. Pretty simple. It's a nice little bonus to damage. And then the huge one, activating deception skills grants you 15 shield every 1 second for 4 seconds. They nerfed this, but honestly it doesn't really matter. 15% every 1 second for 4 seconds is still insanely busted. It's insane. Once you add that on top of the 50%, it's not impossible to die. I want to make it sound like you're just invincible or anything, but as long as you have those survivability mods on your gear, and as long as you're continuously killing enemies and CCing them, it's pretty hard to die in groups. If you're fighting a single enemy, that's when things get a little bit more difficult. This is mostly a build geared toward tons of crowds. When it comes to one-on-one combat, that's probably the biggest weakness of this build, but you get to use a revolver. This is probably the strongest revolver build in the game, period. I'm probably one of the few people who has invested this much time into the worst weapon in the game, and I'm glad I did. If you want to be John Wick of Outriders, you need this build. But I wanted to share this because I know a lot of people are bummed out about the nerfs and stuff. There's a lot of really interesting builds you can use. This is not a meta build by any stretch of the imagination. Maybe, I know Time Rift is kind of meta, I guess, but the fact that I'm using a revolver puts me at a huge disadvantage. A huge disadvantage. It's literally the worst weapon type in the entire game. It's the worst weapon and the worst weapon type in the entire game. That's kind of crazy when you think about it. So yeah, I would encourage you to think outside the box when making builds in Outriders. You can do a lot of really interesting things. On the surface, this build doesn't seem that impressive, but once you actually use it and understand how things blend together to make the build that I did, it makes a lot of sense. So I would encourage you to think outside the box when making builds, and hopefully I helped you in some way. The Worldslayer review or whatever, it's coming, okay? It's coming. I'm working on it. Give me some time. I don't want to just throw it out when I just started playing the game or whatever. I've only beat the end game one time. I need to test it out more, see how much longevity it has, stuff like that. I don't want to throw out a review on something when I'm ignorant of how it works, okay? Just give me a little bit of time. It won't take too long. It should be out next week at the latest. Anyway, God bless. Lights out.